It began on an ordinary December evening, one of those nights when the world outside feels wrapped in calm and the scent of pine lingers in every corner of the house. I was sitting on the couch, stringing the last few ornaments onto the Christmas tree, when my husband walked in with a hesitant smile and said the sentence that would turn the season upside down: "My ex is coming to Christmas dinner." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. Surely he was joking. But the way his eyes shifted, the way he rubbed the back of his neck, told me this wasn't a punchline. It was real. Now, I'd love to tell you that I handled it with perfect grace right away, that I smiled and said, "Of course, darling, the more the merrier." But inside, my thoughts spun like a snowstorm. Why her? Why now? What could possibly make him think this was a good idea? I didn't say those things out loud. I've learned that silence can be far more powerful than reaction. Instead, I took a slow breath, placed the ornament on the tree, and simply said, "All right." He looked surprised, as if he'd expected me to explode. But I didn't. Sometimes, when the universe throws you into something uncomfortable, the best thing you can do is stay still, because in stillness, truth reveals itself. As the days inched toward Christmas, I couldn't help but wonder what that dinner would be like. My imagination painted every possible scenario, from awkward small talk to old memories slipping into the conversation like uninvited guests. But more than anything, I wondered what she wanted. Was it closure, curiosity, or was she there to test boundaries, to see if what she once had still lingered in some hidden corner of his heart? Those thoughts would visit me like little ghosts while I wrapped gifts or stirred the cranberry sauce. But instead of letting them take root, I turned them into resolve. I decided that no matter what happened that night, I would meet it with calm. There's a strange kind of strength in composure. It's not about pretending you don't care. It's about knowing exactly who you are and refusing to let someone else's presence disturb that peace. I reminded myself of that as I set the table on Christmas morning, arranging each plate and candle with quiet intention. Every flicker of light felt like a reminder that I wasn't competing with anyone. Love isn't a contest, and the past isn't a threat unless you allow it to be. When he noticed my calmness, I could tell it disarmed him a bit. Maybe he'd expected tension. Maybe he thought I'd find an excuse to cancel dinner altogether. But I didn't. I wanted to face this moment fully, not out of pride, but out of understanding. Life has a way of testing what we say we've mastered. We talk about forgiveness, security, trust, but they only become real when they're tested in uncomfortable ways. And maybe that's what this dinner was meant to be. Not a disruption, but a test of how far we'd come. I didn't see her as the woman who once stood beside my husband. I saw her as someone who once shared a chapter of his life, a chapter that had closed long before mine began. People come and go for reasons we don't always understand, and holding on to bitterness only ties us to moments that no longer serve us. So, as Christmas Eve arrived and the soft hum of carols filled the room, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Not the kind that comes from having everything perfect, but the kind that comes from trusting yourself enough to face imperfection with grace. Whatever story the night was about to tell, I was ready for it, ready not to fight for my place, but to simply stand in it, confident and calm. Because sometimes life gives you moments that are not meant to test your love for someone else. They're meant to remind you of your love for yourself. The day of the dinner arrived, and with it came a quiet tension that hummed beneath every festive sound. The house was glowing, candles flickering on the mantel, soft music floating through the air, and the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon filling every corner. I'd spent the whole day preparing not just the meal, but myself. I wanted everything to feel warm, calm, welcoming, even if a small part of me was bracing for something unpredictable. It's funny how we can set a perfect stage for chaos without even realizing it. As I laid out the last set of silverware, I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflection of the dining room window. I didn't see nervousness. I saw a woman who had decided that no one, not even a ghost from the past, was going to shake her peace. There was a kind of strength in that stillness. People often confuse peace with passivity, but they're not the same. Peace is active. It's a choice, a discipline, a quiet statement that says, I am grounded right here, no matter who walks through that door. Then came the moment. The doorbell rang once, twice, crisp and confident. My husband froze for half a second, and that was all I needed to know. His nerves betrayed him. I gave him a small smile and went to open the door myself. And there she was, the ex. She looked perfect, in that way people do when they're trying not to seem like they're trying too hard. She wore a deep red dress that matched the poinsettias on the table, her hair perfectly done, her smile rehearsed. She held a fancy box of chocolates, the kind meant to impress, not to share. For a brief second, time seemed to pause. There was no anger, no awkwardness, just a quiet exchange of understanding. Two women, once strangers, now standing on either side of a man's story. I welcomed her in with a steady voice, "Merry Christmas, come on in," and stepped aside. She smiled politely, and her eyes scanned the house, the tree, the decorations, perhaps comparing, perhaps remembering. My husband followed her with a look that mixed nostalgia and relief, like he was hoping this would go smoothly but wasn't entirely convinced it would. Dinner began. With light conversation, surface-level chatter about weather, holiday plans, mutual acquaintances, but underneath the words there was tension, the kind that hums quietly between sentences. Every laugh felt a touch too loud, every pause just a little too long. She reminisced about old memories, small moments she clearly thought were charming, stories that started with "remember when" and ended with an uncomfortable silence. My husband would smile awkwardly, and I would simply sip my wine, letting her words dissolve into the clinking of cutlery. It's fascinating how people can walk into your home and try to bring pieces of your partner's past with them, as if testing whether there's still a place for them in the present. But the thing about the past is, it has power only if you let it. I decided not to. Instead, I leaned into kindness. I complimented her dress, thanked her for the chocolates, and asked her about her work, her life. She wasn't expecting that. My calm seemed to throw her off balance, as though she had come prepared for tension but found none. As the evening continued, I noticed something shift. My husband started to relax, her stories grew shorter, and the air around the table softened. The glow from the candles reflected off the ornaments, casting a golden warmth that made the whole room feel like it belonged to the present, not the past. It wasn't about pretending there was no history. It was about showing that history had no hold here anymore. And somewhere between the main course and dessert, I realized something beautiful. Peace is not about control, it's about confidence. It's not about proving anything, it's about knowing you don't have to. By simply being still in who I was, I changed the energy of the room without saying a single confrontational word. That kind of quiet power doesn't come from ego. It comes from love, maturity, and the decision to rise above what no longer matters. That night, the dinner table wasn't a battlefield. It was a mirror, reflecting exactly what each of us had become. The sound of laughter echoed around the table, but it didn't quite reach the heart. It was the kind of laughter people use to fill silence, to hide the unease they don't want anyone to see. The clinking of silverware against plates provided a rhythm to the tension that hung between us. On the surface, everything looked perfect. The table set with care, the food warm, the tree lights twinkling softly in the background. But beneath it all, there was something else, an invisible current running quietly beneath our smiles. She sat across from me, poised, polished, and perfectly aware of her every gesture. She had this habit of leaning slightly toward my husband whenever she spoke, as though the rest of the room didn't exist. Her voice would soften when she said his name, and her eyes lingered a moment too long when she mentioned old times. And yet, every time she brought up a story that began with "remember when," I noticed the slightest flicker of discomfort in his eyes, a quick glance my way, almost like an apology without words. He knew exactly what she was doing, and so did I. But instead of interrupting or reacting, I chose to play a different game, the game of grace. I poured her more wine when her glass ran low. I laughed politely at her stories, even when I could sense the hidden sharpness beneath them. Because sometimes kindness isn't weakness, it's strategy. It unsettles people who expect confrontation. It makes them question their own intentions. I didn't need to prove anything that night. I just needed to let the truth reveal itself quietly and completely. There was a moment, a small, almost unnoticeable one, when the tone of the evening began to shift. She was in the middle of a story about a trip they'd once taken together. Her voice carried that mix of nostalgia and pride, but I could see the cracks beginning to form. My husband's responses had grown shorter, his laughter less genuine. He wasn't reminiscing, he was remembering why that chapter had ended, and I could see her realizing it too. I started asking questions, not to challenge her, but to guide the energy somewhere lighter. "That sounds like a beautiful place," I said softly. "Did you go back there again?" Her expression faltered just slightly, and she shook her head. "No, I never did." The room went still for a second. It wasn't a cruel silence, just an honest one. It was the silence of realization, the kind that reminds you some doors close for good reason. As the meal went on, I began to notice something beautiful. My peace was contagious. My husband relaxed, his laughter became real again, and the story started shifting from the past to the present. We talked about traditions, family, plans for the future. Even she began to soften, her sharp edges dulling in the warmth of the room. It wasn't that she was defeated, it was that she was disarmed. You can't fight calmness. You can't challenge sincerity. I watched her glance around the room, at the tree, the ornaments, the small touches of love that made this house a home. She didn't need anyone to tell her what she was seeing. It was clear in her eyes, the quiet recognition that this was no longer her story to tell. She was a visitor in a life that had moved on. And in that moment, I realized that the strongest person at that table wasn't the one speaking the loudest or smiling the brightest. It was the one who didn't need to prove her place. That night, I understood that real confidence doesn't come from possession. It comes from peace. As the night went on, something in the air began to change. The polite conversation had settled into a rhythm, and the earlier tension was thinning like mist after rain. The candles had burned lower, their flames softer now, casting long shadows across the table. That's when I felt it, that quiet turning point when control shifts, not through power, but through presence. I didn't need to say much, I simply began to share. Not stories to compete, but stories that spoke truth. Our truth. I started to talk about the little things my husband and I had built together. Not the glamorous milestones, but the ordinary moments that make a life. The late night talks after bad days, the laughter over burnt pancakes, the quiet forgiveness that follows misunderstandings, the kind of love that doesn't shout for attention, but grows deeper in the background, steady and real. I spoke without intention to prove anything. I was just speaking from a place of contentment. But sometimes contentment has a way of shaking people more than confrontation ever could. She listened, smiling, but her eyes told another story. There was a flicker there, a kind of awareness she hadn't expected to feel. I could see her piecing things together, realizing that what she once knew of him wasn't who he was anymore. That love had changed him, shaped him, matured him in ways she might never have seen. It wasn't that she'd lost something. It was that she no longer recognized what she thought she'd lost. And that realization, I think, hurt her more than she anticipated. It wasn't about comparison. I wasn't there to show her I'd won or that she'd lost. Life doesn't work that way. I just wanted her to see the truth, that people evolve, relationships grow, and sometimes the best thing that can happen to two people is that they don't end up together. Maybe she thought she'd walk in that night and see the same man she once knew, the same dynamic she once controlled, but she didn't. The man sitting beside me wasn't the man she used to know. He was stronger, kinder, and more grounded, not because I changed him, but because life had. I remember looking at her when she thought no one was watching. Her expression softened, and for a fleeting moment I felt a strange kind of empathy for her. It must be hard coming face to face with something that could have been yours once, but realizing it never truly was meant for you. You could tell she wasn't angry, she was just undone. Not by anything cruel, not by humiliation, but by the simple truth of how time moves and love evolves. At one point, she asked me how we met. Not out of curiosity, but maybe to understand the story that had replaced hers. I smiled and told her gently that it wasn't an instant spark or a grand fairy tale. It was something real, something that grew quietly and became unbreakable because it was built on honesty and patience. She nodded, eyes glossy but smiling, as if she finally saw the difference. And in that moment, I knew she didn't need me to say anything more. The lesson wasn't in the words, it was in the energy. She saw that what once was hers had found peace elsewhere, not better, not worse, just right where it belonged. And that realization broke her heart in the most human way. Sometimes the hardest truths aren't the ones shouted across a room. They're the ones whispered by time, reflected in the way people have grown without you. Dessert was served and the evening had reached that quiet, reflective hour when everyone starts to relax. The plates had been cleared, the music was low, and the candles flickered lazily as if even they were ready to rest. The heaviness that had once filled the room was almost gone. Almost. I could sense it in her eyes, that lingering emotion she was trying so hard to hide. The polite smile she wore had begun to tremble at the edges. You could feel her holding herself together, like someone trying to stand still in the middle of an emotional storm. When she set down her fork and said she needed a moment, no one questioned it. She stood up slowly, excusing herself, her voice quiet but strained. I watched her leave the table and disappear down the hallway toward the coat rack. My husband's eyes followed her, and after a brief pause, he stood too. "I'll just make sure she's all right," he said softly. I nodded, not out of submission or curiosity, but because I didn't need to know what was being said. I already understood. Some moments don't need to be overheard, they just need to be respected. I sat there, tracing my fingers along the rim of my glass, listening to the faint sound of muffled voices near the door. The tone wasn't angry, it wasn't confrontational. It was soft, emotional, filled with the weight of unfinished feelings. I could sense her tears even before I saw them. There was a rhythm to it, his quiet reassurance, her choked responses, the occasional silence that spoke louder than words. I didn't move. I didn't interrupt. This wasn't my scene to enter, it was theirs to close. When she finally returned to the room, her eyes were red but clear. She smiled, a real fragile smile this time, and said she had to leave. My husband walked her to the door again, helping her with her coat, his voice gentle and kind, and when she stepped outside into the cold night, I saw her pause for a moment on the porch, looking back at the warm glow spilling from the house. That light seemed to hold something sacred, a kind of peace that she couldn't take with her. Tears glistened in her eyes as she whispered a faint goodbye and disappeared into the night. He came back to the table quietly, the sound of the door closing behind him like the final page of a long, unfinished chapter. When our eyes met, he didn't have to explain. I could see it, that heavy mix of relief and compassion. He wasn't sad because of her, he was sad for the memories that had no place left to belong, for the closure that came later than expected. I reached across the table and took his hand, not to claim him, but to ground us both in the moment. We sat there in silence for a while, just breathing. The house felt lighter, as though something old had finally been released. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious. What I felt was empathy, the kind that only comes when you witness another person's pain and recognize that it's not about winning or losing, it's about letting go. That night, when I walked past the front door and looked out into the cold, I thought about her tears. They weren't from humiliation or regret, they were from realization. She had come expecting to find a trace of the past, but instead she found peace, and it wasn't hers. She had seen with her own eyes what moving on truly looks like, what healing sounds like, what love becomes when it's no longer about possession but partnership. And as I turned off the lights and the house settled into its quiet hum, I understood something deeply. Closure doesn't always come from words. Sometimes it comes from seeing the truth you tried for years to avoid. When the house finally grew still and the night settled into its calm, I sat there for a long time, just listening to the quiet, the faint ticking of the clock, the soft hum of the heater, the last glow of the candles melting into wax. It all felt different now, The tension that had filled the air earlier was gone, replaced by something gentle, something peaceful. I could still see the reflection of the Christmas lights on the window, tiny dots of gold shimmering in the dark, and it struck me how much can change in just one evening. What began as a night of discomfort had somehow turned into a lesson about love, grace, and the power of letting go. My husband came back from the hallway, his steps slower now, his face thoughtful. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me, really looked at me, the way people do when they realize they've just witnessed something they can't quite put into words. There was gratitude in his eyes, mixed with relief, maybe even admiration. He sat beside me, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The silence said everything. It said that what we had built together was real, strong enough to stand through the unexpected, steady enough to absorb the shock of old ghosts showing up uninvited. I thought back to the start of the evening, how uncertain I had felt when he told me his ex was coming. The unease, the overthinking, the quiet questions that had followed me all week. And yet, as I sat there at the end of it all, I felt something I hadn't expected. Pride. Not the kind of pride that shouts, but the kind that settles in quietly, reminding you that you chose to rise above when you could have chosen to fall apart. Because here's the truth. Strength doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like restraint. It looks like holding your ground without raising your voice. It looks like smiling even when someone is waiting for you to crack. That night taught me that grace is not weakness. It's control guided by compassion. It's the ability to stay kind in the face of discomfort, to extend understanding even when you're being tested. And that, I realize, is far more powerful than any argument or outburst could ever be. I knew she left in tears, but I didn't see those tears as a victory. I saw them as a release. She wasn't crying because she had been humiliated. She was crying because she had seen what peace looks like when you stop fighting for what's no longer yours. Maybe she saw herself reflected in me, not as a rival, but as a mirror showing her what acceptance feels like. It wasn't pity I felt, it was empathy. Because we've all been there, holding on to a memory that the world has already moved past, trying to find belonging in a chapter that's long since closed. That night didn't just test my patience, it reaffirmed my understanding of love. Real love isn't about possession. It's not about proving who's right or who's better. It's about partnership, balance, and the quiet confidence of knowing that what's meant for you doesn't need defending. My husband didn't have to say a single word to assure me where his heart was. His actions, his eyes, his peace said it all. When we finally turned off the last light and headed to bed, I paused for a second, looking back at the dinner table, the empty glasses, the flickering candle still fighting against the last bit of wax, and I smiled. Because in that silence, I knew something profound. Peace will always outshine pride.